From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Well, good afternoon. My name is Jason Steinhauer. I'm a program specialist in the John W. Kluge Center at the Library of Congress. On behalf of the Library of Congress, thank you for coming to the 13th Annual National Book Festival. Hope you've had a great day. Before we begin, just want to make you aware that today's lecture is being webcast or filmed for later broadcast on the Library of Congress website. We will have a question and answer period after the speaker's presentation. And if you come up to the microphone and ask questions, which we hope that you will, please note that you are consenting for your voice and your likeness to potentially be used on the Library of Congress website in the future. Also, if you have cell phones, please set them to vibrate at this time. I have the privilege to introduce Wesley Granberg-Michaelson to you this afternoon. Now, I work in the John W. Kluge Center at the Library of Congress, and at the Kluge Center, we bring scholars and researchers from around the world to the library to interact with our collections, to mine the rich wisdom and resources that are here, and to create works of scholarship that then go on to inform policymakers and the public. So all that means is we bring really smart people to the library, give them the resources that they need to write books, which is what we're here to celebrate. And those books can be quite impactful. And those books can tell us things about our world that we don't necessarily know, or show us things in our society, in our lives, that we have not yet seen ourselves. And today I have the privilege to introduce to you a scholar, Wesley Granberg-Michaelson, who has written a book about what's happening in the Christian world, and the seismic shifts in demographics, in practices, in creative expressions within that religion, and what the impact is on the religion and on societies around the world. I should note that today you have a sneak preview of a larger discussion on this topic that will happen at the library on October 16th, where renowned religion scholars will congregate at the Kluge Center to discuss the impact of this seismic shift in Christianity on the United States. I do hope that you'll join us for that. But today, you'll hear distinctly from Wesley Granberg-Michaelson, who was a distinguished visiting scholar at the Kluge Center in 2012, and before that was the head leader of the Reformed Church of America here in the United States for 17 years. So without further ado, please welcome Wesley Granberg-Michaelson.
Thank you very much, Jason. I appreciate that, and I want to begin by saying a word of thanks to the John W. Kluge Center. This is a tremendous institution at the Library of Congress, and especially to Dr. James Billington, the Librarian of Congress, for his graciousness in appointing me as a scholar there, and more than that, for the impact he's had on my intellectual and my spiritual journey, and far more than that, his leadership in the Library of Congress has made this institution a catalyst for the vitality of the intellectual life of the nation, and we all owe him a tremendous debt of gratitude. Thank you. Yesterday, when I was wandering around this fabulous place, a couple behind me was talking. I overheard them talking about what events they wanted to go to. And one of them said, "What about that from Times Square to Timbuktu? Is that a travel thing?" In some ways, it is. This is a religious travelogue. What I want to share with you today results from one of the major changes in the history of Christianity in the world. The shift in the center of gravity of world Christianity has moved decisively to the southern hemisphere. And over the past century, this is the most astonishing shift in the presence of world Christians that has ever happened in 2,000 years. Several writers have written about this, but we've barely begun to understand its consequences. And that's the reason why I wrote this book, From Times Square to Timbuktu, the post-Christian West meets the non-Western church. for I wanted to explore two things. First of all, what this shift means for the future of world Christianity. And second, what this shift means for congregations and their ministry and their life right here in North America. Now, first, to tell you the story. In 1910, Europe was the heartland of Christianity, and between Europe and the United States, 80% of Christians lived there. 100 years later, only 40% did. In 1910, Africans constituted only 2% of all the Christians in the world. 100 years later, 1 out of every 4 Christians is an African. It's one of the most astonishing stories in modern Christian history. 494 million Christians in Africa, and that will grow to about 633 million by the year 2025. And that will mean there will be as many people in the Christian community in Africa as in Latin America, which is projected to grow to about 640 million by that time. Next year, thousands of people will be going to Brazil to watch the World Cup. They'll be going to the country that today holds the largest number of Catholics and the largest number of Pentecostals. Latin America and Africa combined today constitute 1 billion people who are part of the Christian community. Now, this shift has not only gone to the global south, but it's also gone to the east. This is a Sunday. And while statistics are hard to come by, in all likelihood, today more Christians worshiped in congregations in China than in the United States. The Buddhist population of Asia was 50% in 1910. 100 years later, it's 22%. The religion that's grown the fastest in Asia is the Muslim community, Islam. However, in the last 10 years in Asia, Christianity has grown at a rate of 2.4%, Islam at the rate of 1.5%. What all this means is that there's been this dramatic shift in what we call the center of gravity, or the statistical center of Christian faith. You can plot through history where on the world an equal number of Christians live to the north and the south and the east and the west. That's the statistical center of gravity of Christianity. For 1,000 years, this was in Europe. And then it began to move to the global south in a swift way, so that by 1980, more Christians lived in the global south than the global north for the first time in 1,000 years. And by 2010, the statistical center of Christianity was located at a point near Timbuktu. Now, what does this mean for the shape and the future of world Christianity? For this shift is not simply about geography. Rather, it's shifting the mindset in the cultures wherein Christian faith finds itself. The striking reality is that today Christianity has become a non-Western religion. The dominant expressions of Christianity are emerging today outside the familiar home of Western culture and the way that it's been shaped by the Enlightenment. The real story of Christianity around the world today is not the declining numbers of Christians in mainline denominations in the United States, but rather the resurgence of Christianity in the non-Western world. Part of this is because there's a new focus on spiritual experience, and that's seen perhaps most dramatically within the Pentecostal community. 3 weeks ago, I had the opportunity to be in Kuala Lumpur at the World Pentecostal Conference. Every 3 years, Pentecostals from around the world gather, 3,500. And this community has now become one of the dominant growing forces within the world of Christianity. Today, well, in 1970, only 5% of all Christians would be classified as Pentecostal. Today, 1 out of every 4 Christians is Pentecostal. Pentecostals have grown at 4 times the rate of other Christians, at 4 times of the rate of global population. You could think of it this way: 1 out of every 12 people alive today in the world is Pentecostal. In Asia, 80% of conversions are to those of Pentecostal persuasion, so 1 out of every 4 Pentecostals in the world lives in Asia. 1 out of 3 lives in Africa. And in Latin America, Pentecostalism is growing at 3 times the rate of the Catholic Church. What many observers fail to understand is that Pentecostal and other highly indigenized expressions of Christianity in the global South free Christianity from the baggage and history of colonialism, and in many cases have freed Christianity from white missionary control, and have provided a new indigenous dynamism and growth, so that today there are 600 million people who classify themselves as Pentecostal or charismatic, and that group is roughly as large as all those churches which belong to the World Council of Churches, which is made up primarily of Orthodox and mainline Protestant. And yet those 2 worlds are so separated and have so little contact between one another that in the book I describe the relationship as one of ecclesiological apartheid. Now, while the momentum and future of world Christianity has shifted to the global South, the power, the institutional dominance, the theological capital, and the financial resources remain in the global North. 2 days ago, I was looking at a survey recently begun by a group that I work with, the Global Christian Forum, of 600 theological educators around the world. Their finding was probably not surprising. Those involved in theological institutions in United States and Europe believe we have either enough theological institutions or perhaps too many, while those in Africa and Latin America say the degree of theological education capacity is way too short, is much more in need of strengthening. They also say, in an interesting fashion, that the most important element in determining the quality of theological education is, quote, the integrity of its senior leaders. All this puts into perspective the tremendous significance of the election of Pope Francis as the first non-European pope in 1,200 years. When you listen to him speak, I think you hear not simply a Catholic voice, not simply a Franciscan voice, but you hear the voice of Christians emerging in the global South. Now, what does all of these global shifts mean for us here locally? The global, in many ways, has become local. Some people have tried to coin a new term called glocal, meaning that that's what's happening. And this has happened in a remarkable way within North America. Migration is bringing this global story to our doorstep. Now listen to these statistics. There are 214 million people today who are migrants, who are moving from one country to another. Of those, 105 million are Christian. Since 1965, the last time that there was major immigration reform in the United States, this country has become what is commonly called the most religiously diverse country in the world. And it is the case that there are now 2,000 mosques, that Buddhists cite United States as their chief destination if they're migrants. But the popular assumptions about migration really are wrong. Think of these statistics. There are 43 million foreign residents living in the United States today. Of that number, 74% are Christian, 5% are Muslim, 4% are Buddhist, and 3% are Hindu. So immigration has actually had its most dramatic effect on the Christian community in the United States, bringing the diversity of world Christianity to our doorstep, even though we barely recognize what is happening. There are, for instance, 50 million Hispanics living in our land today. 70% of those are Catholic, meaning 1 out of 3 Catholics today is Hispanic, and the Hispanic Catholic community accounts for 71% of the growth of Catholicism since 1960. Even more interesting is this statistic, given to me by a friend who's a head of Hispanic ministry at the U.S. Catholic Conference here in Washington, D.C. Alejandro said to me, if you look at millennials in the Catholic Church, meaning those born after 1982, 54% are Hispanic. In Los Angeles, even today, 70% of Catholics are Hispanic. And again, this is not just about numbers. Hispanics bring expressions of faith shaped by their own Latino culture. More than that, over half of Catholic Hispanics classify themselves as charismatic. But there are also 23% of Hispanics who are Protestant. That means about 9.5 million, or think of it this way, there are more Protestant Latinos in the United States than there are Episcopalians. Often, they bring a combination of Orthodox theology, Pentecostal style, and social justice commitments. And the truth is that if it were possible somehow to deport those residents among us who are here without proper documentation, we would be robbing both Protestant and Catholic parishes of much of their religious vitality. The Hispanic community will grow to over 100 million by the year 2050, and that will make this a defining feature of American Christianity. But look then to other immigrant groups, Asian Americans. In our land today, there are 17.3 million Asian Americans. The growth rate of this community is actually the fastest of any other group. And by 2050, they will constitute 40 million of our fellow citizens. 44% of these are Christians. The country that sends the second most immigrants to the United States after Mexico is, in fact, the Philippines. At Fuller Seminary, one of the leading evangelical seminaries in the United States, with 5,000 students, 1,100 are either Asian citizens or Asian Americans. We see all the time the impact of Korean congregations and their growth. Further, there are an estimated 1,000 independent Chinese congregations in the United States. I used to head a denomination, the Reformed Church in America. The number of independent Chinese congregations in the United States is about as large as the Reformed Church in America. So think of it that way. But then consider immigration from Africa. The numbers are smaller, yet there's been also a dramatic increase with citizens coming largely from Nigeria, Ethiopia, Egypt, Kenya, and Ghana. Many of these bring strong Christian faith with them, and often churches that have grown up indigenously within African soil rather than those who have been started by foreign missionaries. A simple example would be the Redeemed Christian Church of God, founded in Nigeria in 1952. Its leader, Enoch Adeboye, was at Kuala Lumpur. That church has now morphed into a network of churches and denominations 5 million strong in 147 countries. And last June, they dedicated a worship pavilion in Texas at the cost of $15.5 million. They have many congregations through North Texas and elsewhere in the U.S. Or take the Church of Pentecost from Ghana, now 2.2 million members in 86 countries, including 70 congregations in the United States. In New York City alone, there are 150 African immigrant congregations. Here in D.C., a lot of my research I did at the Library of Congress. Some of my research I did by talking to taxi cab drivers. And on a trip recently in D.C., I had 3 taxi cab drivers, all of whom were Ethiopian. And so I asked them about the Ethiopian community in D.C. and then went back to the Kluge Center and did more research. There are an estimated 250,000 Ethiopians living in the greater D.C. area. They worship in 35 Ethiopian churches in the greater D.C. area. You go to Minneapolis, St. Paul, one place that has actually studied this carefully. You find there 67 Asian immigrant congregations and 73 African immigrant congregations. All of this represents a tremendous challenge to the existing congregations in North America, of which there are about 350,000. Of those congregations, only 6% can genuinely be called multiracial, meaning more than 20% of their membership is of a racial ethnic group other than their majority. The theme of hospitality becomes of urgent importance to the future of Christianity in North America, and it's worth remembering that the Hebrew Scriptures in the Old Testament mention love of stranger 35 times, mention love of neighbor once. It's assumed that love of stranger is the way in which we judge the vitality and integrity of the faith that is held. World Christianity has come to our doorstep, and the dialogue we need to have now is between those churches nurtured in Western culture by the Enlightenment, which carry the tradition of the church, but struggle for vitality in increasingly secularized cultures, and those churches growing in non-Western cultures with vibrant spirituality, rapid growth, but often very sectarian in their mindset, isolated from the historic streams of Christianity. You may think of it perhaps in this way. The Enlightenment elevated the values of reason and individual autonomy. Pre-Enlightenment Christianity was shaped by revelation and a corporate consciousness. Christianity had to engage, critique, and come to terms in creative ways with Western culture. And we take all of that today for granted in our own understanding of faith. Now, the future of Christianity will be shaped by its presence in non-Western cultures, in a similar process of engagement, critique, and coming to a new integration is underway. The key issue is the relationship between the spiritual and empirical worlds. Enlightenment Christianity drew those boundaries clearly and even policed that relationship, but emerging Christianity from Africa, from Hispanic culture, and Asian cultures begins with very different understandings, where the relationship between the spiritual and the empirical is far more fluid and permeable. So this dialogue between Western Christianity and the emerging non-Western expressions of faith becomes critical. There is no more important ecumenical challenge today And because of global migration, which is a gift, that interchange now can take place in communities, in congregations, right here at home, because the non-Western culture is encountering, because the Western culture, secularized, is now encountering the non-Western church. And that's the dialogue all of us are invited into. I would love to hear your questions. Thank you very much. I think we've left about 15 minutes for questions. Yes.
Well, I'm totally fascinated by your book. We have a friend who has been going to the southeastern part of the globe for many years and had kind of told us that this shift was occurring. One kind of comment that you may want to respond to, and then a question. The comment is, I'm a member of the Episcopal Church, and I have heard stories of Episcopal or Anglican bishops in various countries in Africa sending priests to the United States saying that there is a need for a resurgence of faith here. And then my question is, do you think or see any connection between the rise of the Pentecostal faith in some of the non-Western and in the southern non-Western countries and in the southern hemisphere, and any tie into the economic growth that is occurring and the rise of a middle class in those same countries where you're seeing the rise of Pentecostalism?
Yeah. To your first comment, it is actually a fairly frequent pattern that not only in the Episcopal Church, but many churches that become denominations in Africa that are what we call African instituted churches, churches formed in Africa by Africans for Africans, grow and come to the point of saying, as they expand into Europe, then they expand into the United States through migration, but often will say, we are commissioning and sending missionaries to Africa, missionaries to the United States. In doing my research, I read the thesis of Harvey Kwiani from Malawi, who's done a whole PhD on the experience of being a missionary from Africa to Europe and Africa to the United States. So yes. The second part of your question, what we often don't realize about Pentecostalism is that in the Global South, much of Pentecostal faith is made up of those who are on the margins of society. It's really the church of the poor. Patterns of immigration of migrants from Global South to the North who are Pentecostal often do happen as those communities begin to move towards middle class. You're correct about that, but the vast majority of Pentecostals in the Global South are often those who are on the margins of society within their countries.
Thank you.
Do you anticipate, given the Roman Catholicism's shift to the southern hemisphere, that in Italy, the Vatican will think about liquidating its assets?
I mean, who knows? I have a good friend who worked at the U.S. Catholic Conference who was talking about Pope Francis, and he said to me, this is how we Catholics think about this. If you were a screenwriter and you came to a Hollywood producer and said, I've got a script for a movie, here's what happens. A reigning pope goes on a retreat and has a vision and decides that he's going to resign. Hasn't happened for 1,500 years. The Cardinal of Conclaves goes into session. They pick someone outside of Europe from the Global South. That person takes the name of Francis and starts washing the feet of Muslims and acting in ways where he gets away from the luxury of the Vatican's apartments. The producer would say, forget about it, it's too unrealistic, that movie would never be made. I think it's very hard, difficult to say what now is going to happen in the future of the Catholic Church, but I think that Pope Francis has initiated in simple ways a whole new perspective of what it means to be Christian and what our deepest priorities might be. There are many very deeply entrenched forces within the Vatican. Who knows how they will respond? But I think it's very hard to predict the future because no one would have predicted even where we are right now.
Yes. What is the relationship between non-Western Christianity and Islam?
Yeah. It's a fascinating question. Islam constitutes about 23-24% of world Christianity, of world religion today. And in those countries where there are both Pentecostal communities and Islamic communities, what we most hear about are when there are situations of tension and situations of violence. That is by far the minority. 62% of all Muslims are in Asia, the largest population in Indonesia. There are also growing numbers of Pentecostal churches in Indonesia. Similarly, in Malaysia, where I was three weeks ago, the relationship, especially in Asian countries, between Christian communities, including Pentecostal ones, and Islamic communities, by and large, is a very harmonious relationship. And I think that's actually the dominant patterns. The things that make the news and that are terrible are by far the minority picture.
You made a brief comment. You encouraged congregations to think about hospitality in the United States. Would you give us some practical advice? Take, say, the situation of Copts in Egypt. I'm sure a lot of Copts are fleeing Egypt and some are coming to the United States. Would you have some practical advice for what congregations might do and what they ought to do?
Absolutely, and I can tell you I have a whole chapter in my book that tries to spell out exactly what congregations might do. It begins by simply taking note of who are those congregations and immigrants that are in our midst. Taking an inventory in the city where I live in Grand Rapids, Michigan, which is sort of the home of Jerry Ford and Dutch West Michigan culture. We simply began asking, how many immigrant communities are there in this town? We found right away 22 of them, most of which were just off of our radar. So it begins, I think, by finding out who's there, then extending the opportunities where we share together our own Christian narratives, our own Christian stories. There may be practical ways, such as ESL, the congregation where my wife and I attend. We've done a lot of work in teaching English as a second language, which then has led to a whole set of relationships to those who have come as strangers into our midst. And from there, you begin to say, what would it mean for us to enter into fellowship and into a life of worship together? The first step is simply being attentive to who the process of global immigration, or if you think of this theologically, you would say, migrants are potential missionaries. Who has God brought into our midst?
Thank you. A very provocative presentation. Quick question. What I'm hearing is more than just a global shift, but I'm also hearing two possible different worldviews. One in the north, that's Western, more rational, formed by the Enlightenment, more institutionally based. The southern, more non-Western, more animist, more charismatic. Can those two worlds coexist under the same house of faith?
I think they have to, and I think that is precisely the challenge that we face. And I think that the dialogue between those two worlds is really the key theological and ecumenical task that faces the church. And that's a dialogue that needs to take place at a global level. It's what we're doing in an organization called the Global Christian Forum, and it needs to take place at a local level. But by all means, it's not just can they, it's that they must. Because in the view that would be taken by any Christian theologian, it's a given that we are in relationship with one another despite those differences. The challenge is to figure out what we do about it.
My question actually follows on. 8 years ago, I visited a Presbyterian seminary in Barranquilla, Colombia, and I visited a class of about 7 students. 3 of them were Pentecostals seeking theological, building on their spiritual calling, seeking also to build up a theological portfolio. How prevalent is this?
Yeah, that's a great question, Paul. One of the encouraging things that's happened in the last 20, 25 years is the growth of Pentecostal theologians and the growing depth of Pentecostal theology. The Pentecostal movement started in many ways as an anti-intellectual movement. And there was a distrust of too much in the head because it all was in the heart and all was experience. And that was often one of the critiques, and I think Pentecostals will say one of the dangers of Pentecostalism. But as Pentecostalism has gained in its stature and presence, it's gained in its own self-confidence. And that's allowed it, I think, to enter into more of a theological process in which it can be reflective about its own life and be more open to others. There's a society of Pentecostal scholars now, very robust, doing really good theological work. They met during the time that the Pentecostal World Conference took place in Kuala Lumpur. One of the seminars I went to, for instance, was on Pentecostalism and social justice, looking very deeply at that relationship in theological ways. So the growth of theological inquiry in the Pentecostal world has been, I think, one of the more encouraging things in the last 20, 25 years.
Thank you. I hear the word Pentecostal and it makes me feel somewhat ill at ease. And I think of Rios Montt, I think in Guatemala,
Yep.
and I think there was a definition of some of the ideology in his particular circle that was Pentecostal. And I guess what I want to hear is a way that you see it as a humanizing experience in terms of social justice.
Yep.
And then is there a political arm or a political expression of it in a progressive way, just as there's a progressive strain in some forms of Protestantism and Catholicism, Islam? And I think it's not helpful for me, but I immediately sort of paint a broad brush of something that feels disquieting.
I think that's a really honest and wonderful observation. I think many who are non-Pentecostal share those feelings. I tell you, when I was in Kuala Lumpur in the front row with 5 or 6 other ecumenical delegates with 3,500 Pentecostals raising their hands in worship and beginning to speak in tongues, I felt a little bit disquieted too. It's a natural reaction. But here are 2 things I would say in response. Number one, it's true that there are some figures, and Rios Montt is probably the most famous, who have exercised political leadership in ways that are oppressive and what most people would say really violations of human rights and not the kind of model you'd want. But you also find leaders like that who are Catholic, and leaders like that who are Protestant, and leaders like that of other faiths. It's wrong to connect Pentecostalism as such with such persons. Now, the most interesting question about the future of Pentecostalism is exactly what you say. What kind of impact will it have in the social and economic realities where it's found? The best book that I've found on this is called Global Pentecostalism by Donald Miller and Ted Yamamori. Donald Miller's a sociologist of religion at the University of Southern California, done terrific work. They wanted to find 400 examples of congregations in the global South that were self-sustaining, that were growing, and that were showing direct impact in response to human need and suffering and oppression. That was their criteria. And they gathered examples of 400 such congregations and discovered to their amazement that 85% of them were Pentecostal. What you find in many cases in the Global South is that Pentecostalism's identification with people at the margins of society makes them more acutely concerned with social and economic issues. But they don't come at it ideologically, and they don't come at it with a whole critique the way in which we in the West would. But they would say, we don't have a social gospel, we are a social gospel. In other words, our very existence provides liberation and affirmation for those who live on the margins. And many sociologists who don't have any flesh in this game, who are just sociologists, they'll look at the experience of Pentecostalism and say there's a real affirmation of human worth that comes to people who have been pushed to the margins of the society where they find themselves.
Catholicism's moved south. Protestantism, including Pentecostals, have moved south. Has Eastern Orthodoxy moved its geography at all, or is that a tradition that retains its historic location?
I'm so glad you've raised Orthodoxy, because that's the other really important part of the whole Christian world. It's Orthodox that in the United States, where we look historically and see very dramatic patterns of immigration, and see how the Orthodox community has responded to it. The Orthodox Church is present and moving in the Global South in ways that I have found very surprising. I was on a trip to Cuba 2 years ago and met with the Orthodox Archbishop for Cuba and the Caribbean, and he told me of amazing examples of growth of orthodoxy, especially amongst some of the indigenous tribal people in several of those countries. There's a good friend of mine, Archbishop Makarios, who is the Greek Orthodox Archbishop for all of Africa. He's in Nairobi. And he shows stirring examples of orthodoxy growing in Africa. So we commonly don't think of orthodoxy in that way, but in fact, there are examples of orthodoxy also moving in new ways in the Global South. This is the last question.
It's often been observed that Sunday morning can be the most segregated part of the week, of people's week. And that's true not only from the divisions that you've talked about, but within immigrant communities, within denominations. But it seems to me that young people today and children today are growing up with much more diversity than many of us who are older. And it seems that there is both a demand and a supply, a real hunger for this diversity to be offered as part of the faith experience. I wonder if you have any observations or share that, whether that is a great hope and a generational challenge to us.
I would only agree with you and say so strongly as a pastor and as one who's had responsibility for one of the denominations in North America, as long as the kids who are in our congregations go to schools where they experience cultural and religious diversity and go to churches where it's not present, they'll say, do we really believe what we're saying? So I think it's absolutely urgent, and I think it's possible within a new generation. I thank you so much for your time and your hospitality. Thank you very much.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.